Hello, friends. I was going to address the elephant in the room about my appearance, but I actually think it would be much funnier if I didn't. So just believe that I met a beautiful witch, I broke her heart, and now she has cursed me with this possum body. Or blessed me, depending on your perspective. So, with the rise of Christian nationalism, and with the recent election installing our new tech bro oligarchy, I feel like now is a really important time to speak out proudly about deconstruction and reconstruction and to humanize different ways of thinking. Here I want to talk about deconstructing religion, but I also want to talk about reconstructing a life after that can be fulfilling and fun. My goal is to have a balance of deconstruction videos and reconstruction videos, and after 3 years of deconstructing and trauma therapy and nonstop reading and learning, I have so much I want to connect with people on and discuss, so that's what we're going to do here. So as a little introduction, hello, I'm the Godless Critter. I endured growing up as a Baptist where I took psychic damage every day, and the unhealthy things I learned in that time put me in a position to be recruited into a Christian cult called JMS. I was in it for 4 years until I woke up to that abuse, and I finally escaped. And along with deconstructing that, I accidentally deconstructed all of religion and life and meaning and morality and death. And once I tore that all down, I struggled greatly with nihilism, CPTSD, and OCD. But now I feel like I can cope healthily. I've made friends with the monsters in the abyss. We're buds. I've discovered ways to find peace and fulfillment in my life outside of religion. And while I clearly don't know the answer to everything or have perfect answers, I want to share all of this and discuss it with you, the good, the bad, the helpful, the interesting, the ugly, and the funny. I am a nihilist, an absurdist, an atheist. I'm a mosaic of thousands of ideas and moments in time and experiences. So, in order to get to this point, I had to take the first step. So let's talk about why I am no longer a Christian after 23 years-ish of being a Christian. Before we jump into it, I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath. Some of the things I'm going to say may trigger a feeling of cognitive dissonance or fear, which can hinder critical thinking, and that's by design. You're safe here. No one can hear your thoughts. Anything I say, you can take or leave. You have the internal wisdom to know what's best for you. I'm not trying to convert you. I am only trying to support people who stumbled into the same journey as me and maybe need to feel less alone. The first stage of deconstruction for me was deconstructing the JMS cult. I can talk about that more in the future, but for the first time in my life, I thought critically about my beliefs and not in the shallow way that I claimed to as a Christian before, where I would only kind of ask questions that aligned with my already existing beliefs and only really accept answers that aligned with my pre-existing beliefs. I mean really picking it apart and analyzing it and testing it to see if it holds up. It took developing a primitive initial tool belt of critical thinking. Critical thinking is like a muscle. It atrophies if you don't use it. And boy, was I a wimpy little baby with critical thinking. So it started small, analyzing doubts here and there, until I had built enough muscle to tackle the big ideas in the JMS cult. However, this new beefy, bulked up, sexy, hot, critical thinking muscle accidentally swiped and knocked out the Christian thing too. I didn't start this journey wanting to leave Christianity. It just kinda happened. I really didn't want to lose that security and identity. It was, the biggest part of my identity. But you can't choose what you believe. And the first thought that took a swing at my Christian beliefs was the realization that the God of Christianity is an abuser. This aspect of God's character hit me while I was reading about cult leaders. I learned they often display traits of narcissistic personality disorder, and to be clear, this is not to say that everyone with this disorder is abusive or prone to becoming a cult leader. You can live a happy, normal life with this disorder, with treatment and help, and healthy coping. But cult leaders will often meet all of the diagnostic criteria for this disorder. An untreated narcissist will often do this thing where they test the people who love them to see if they're actually loyal. Cult leaders do this, and it's extremely harmful for people's well-being. For example, in Jonestown, Jones would do drills where he would pass out wine, pretending it was poison to test who would be loyal enough to actually drink the poison before that horrible day actually happened. It was also a tactic for desensitizing them to the true horrific event once the time came. I was thinking about how the leader of JMS exemplified this behavior many times through fasting, 4 a.m. church services, unpaid labor, him yelling at them. As I was reading about this and thinking about JMS, it hit me, the horrible truth that this is exactly what God did in the book of Job, except in the most severe and extreme way possible, where he allows Satan to kill his family, all his farm animals, make him suffer so much with this painful disease, just to test Job's loyalty. And Christians will say this about God even now, that he tests them with hardship. If this is an abusive behavior in humans, why is it suddenly not when it's God? And this is far from the only example. Let's say you have a boyfriend named Kevin. Kevin tells you that you are not worth anything without him. Kevin says you're incomplete without his love, and incomplete without him in your heart. Kevin says if you don't love him and give everything to him, he will hurt you. Kevin says he will break you down and put you through hell just so he can build it into something better and make you better. Kevin says that even though you didn't deserve it, he saved you and you owe him your life. Clearly, Kevin is an abuser. So if you change Kevin out for God, does that suddenly make it not abuse? These are all messages that we were taught about our relationship with God. We were taught that we are broken and incomplete without him. We are threatened with hell or annihilation if we choose life without him. Replace the stories in the Bible with the name Kevin and see how it changes it. If you heard of a friend or sibling in a relationship like this, you would tell them to run. I just feel like every list I look at that is a sign of an abusive relationship applies a lot to our relationship with God as humans. So some people will say,
this is a false comparison because God is God and we're humans. God can do whatever he wants because he's God.
But in my opinion, and this was another realization that hit me like a truck that made me leave Christianity, this means that we're holding God to a lower standard than we hold humans. Humans can figure out what behaviors are abusive, but the maximally good, all-knowing, all-powerful creator and knower of all things just behaves that way? That seems pretty unlikely. Here's another example of us holding God to a lower standard than humans. God demands we all worship him and give our lives to him. He needs our love and validation. Some people, their theology believes, including JMS, that the reason he created humans was for love and validation. I went to therapy and learned how to find value in myself. I learned how to have empathy for myself and love myself by healing my inner child, my wounds, my inner child wounds, the parts of me that formed to protect myself throughout my life. And then I realized, this is why I've always been insecure and needed so much constant external validation from others. It was child wounds. My self-worth wasn't coming from me. I didn't love me. So that explains that. And honestly, now that I've done all that work, I feel very secure and don't have very many insecurities. I don't need others' approval for my self-worth because it's internal and it comes from just being. It seems like the God of the Bible never really got there. So I, a flawed human being, can get there, but not the maximally good God. I think God having abusive tendencies and needing all this external validation is just a reflection of the human psyche, not an actual God. He's definitely a human creation. Another day, I was researching cults, and I learned about how people can't really consent to being in cults due to the intense level of manipulation and the power dynamics at play. I learned about this nifty little acronym called FRIES, and it's an easy way to help us remember the characteristics or requirements for consent. Consent is not exclusive to sex. It applies to relationships, agreements, and more. So the F stands for freely given, meaning without manipulation or pressure, not under the influence of something. Reversible means it can be safely taken back. Informed means everyone is fully aware of what they're agreeing to. Enthusiastic means both parties want it. And specific means that it was well communicated and discussed in the details of what was happening. Already with the first pass through, I am seeing violations of this. A relationship with God is not freely given because you have the threat of hell or annihilation hanging over you, or the threat of not having his protection, or of being incomplete, or being worthless, or even, to some people, demon-possessed. It's also not reversible because, again, threats of hell, demon possession, being worthless, or your entire worth as a human being at stake. It's not enthusiastic in many cases because it doesn't matter if you want it or not. It's presented as the one and only way. We have laws against relationships between bosses and employees because we understand that the power dynamic means that the employee cannot fully consent. Now intensify the power dynamic by 1,000,000 because it's a human and God. You cannot fully consent by choice to a relationship with God according to Christianity. So too long didn't read for this section. God is like an abusive partner. He threatens you. He tells you you're incomplete without him. He tests your loyalty. He expects you to give everything in your life to him. He wants to be your entire identity, and he violates consent. And he violates consent many times in the Bible. Why does it suddenly become okay when it's God? He should know better than anyone on the planet how to not be abusive. If this is a true and good religion, why does it mimic abusive relationships? That was another sticking thought for why I knew that Christianity wasn't true. Why is God and God's word not what we know factually is healthy? Because Christianity is clearly not from a maximally good God. It's from men in the Iron Age who needed therapy before it was invented. It's so clearly written by flawed and abusive men and their perspective on lives and relationships. You can literally see their psyches projected in God's image. If I, a flawed human, can understand abuse, why can't the creator of all humans love and the universe? If he contains all the love in the world, why is he so harmful and hurtful? Why does he need to hurt me to keep me? God's love is not enough to keep me without the manipulation and abuse. His love should be enough. It's so funny seeing this heartfelt plea coming from my possum avatar body. While on the topic of God being a jerk, let's talk about suffering and why its existence in humans, and especially in animals, leads me to believe that God does not exist. My first thought with this rabbit hole was when I heard someone who was leaving JMS before me make the argument that hell is cruel and unusual punishment and makes no sense because finite mistakes never should deserve eternal, horrific, conscious torment. Everyone around me started saying, oh, he's overthinking it, or God doesn't send you to hell, your choices do. And then I had a thought that actually, I agreed. Eternal conscious torment for a finite sin as a human is incredibly fucked up, and clearly not the creation of a loving God. And I also thought about how we aren't putting any blame on God when he set this system up. We like to say, oh, people send themselves to hell because of their actions, but who made it that way? He set the system up where choosing sin leads to hell. And sometimes we don't even choose sin. It's an innate thing, like it's biology. I also had this thought about suffering when I saw that God's reaction to not liking what humans were doing was to wipe them out in a horrific flood. Drowning is a horrible way to die. He couldn't have thought of any other better way to get people on the quote-unquote right path. I thought he was God. Genocide was his only option. Even I could think of better options. Simply, if I were God, I would have just preached better. I would have written better word that moved people's hearts better. And if you think he can't do that, how powerful is your God really? When I experienced watching the death of a loved one, and I saw the suffering it put on my family as we had to watch her pass, I realized this applies to here and now as well, not just the afterlife and not just the Bible. With the critical thinking muscle I had exercised by thinking about how unfair hell is and how unfair the suffering God caused in the flood is, I started to think about the suffering we experience here on earth. It's the same concept. A loving God would not create a world of suffering like this. The suffering far outweighs the good. He could have just decided to make a world with less suffering. I don't even need no suffering. Less suffering, unnecessary suffering, and he didn't. I, even as a human being, if I had the ability, would never have allowed suffering like we see in the world. I wouldn't have allowed the tremendous suffering of even one person if I had the power. Do I need to remind you of the photo of the starving child who had a vulture following her, waiting for her to die, and how the photographer ended his life later due to what he saw? Need I remind you about the quote from a concentration camp wall, if there is a God, he will have to beg for my forgiveness. These sort of things are incompatible with a supposedly loving God who has the ability to stop the suffering, the tremendous suffering, and then chooses not to. There is not a good explanation for the existence of the amount of suffering we see in the world. So there's a few common rebuttals to this. Let's say human suffering is a result of the fall of Adam and Eve. 1, it's nonsense to think that this would be a fair system from a fair God when the punishment is unfathomably disproportionate to the crime actually committed. When a child disobeys, a good parent doesn't even hit them, much less inflict a lifetime of suffering on that kid and all of their future descendants. And yes, a child is a good analogy here because Adam and Eve didn't know between good and evil yet. They were new beings, flawed humans, and were not given the full context of what their disobedience would mean. 2, we acknowledge as humans that collective punishment is cruel and unusual. We call it a damn war crime because of how cruel it is. And somehow it's okay if God does it. 3, if God set this system up, He could have just been more loving and forgiving and not set up a system where punishment for one moment of disobedience is billions of creatures suffering tremendously. That is just absurd. So another argument, let's say suffering is a result of us having free will, or is necessary for us to have free will. 1, natural disasters cause suffering, and those are not a result of human choice. Kids get cancer before they've even had the chance to sin. 2, people who suffer more don't magically have more free will. 3, you can have free will without needing to suffer. You can still choose between neutral and good, or neutral and neutral, or good and good. People who've suffered minimally in their lives still had free will. 4, the amount of suffering that exists is not worth the price of free will, dude. If you truly empathize and try to wrap your head around the amount of suffering that has been experienced by humans and other non-human organisms, you would agree. 5, this one's from Bart Ehrman, and I think it's really good. Is there free will in heaven, yes or no? Yes? So then suffering doesn't have to exist for there to be free will. And even more damning, this is something that Alex O'Connor has been talking about a lot lately, and I've got to be honest, I came to this realization because I thought about a possum being scared in a hurricane, okay? But along with humans, I would like to talk about the suffering of animals. Did you know that scientists found bees playing with wooden balls for fun? Scientists found that bumblebees do likely partake in play by observing them with a rolling wooden ball, when the rolling ball, 1, did not contribute to immediate survival strategies, 2, was intrinsically rewarding, and 3, differed from functional behavior in form. So even something as simple as a bumblebee has the desire to play. Did you also know that elephants likely have names for each other? That requires unbelievable intelligence. And even more amazingly, much like humans, elephants have rituals around death and mourning to help them process grief. We've observed them having group long periods of silence. They carry and stroke the bones. And most amazingly of all, we have repeatedly seen that they have burials and bury their dead. One of the key evolutionary traits when we're thinking about human intelligence. Also, bonobo monkeys are known to do things like comfort their friends in distress. They've also been shown to pout and throw fits so they can get empathy from other bonobos. Don't even get me started on the intelligence of an octopus or a crow. But the evidence for animal emotional intelligence and sapience grows every year. And this awareness also comes with suffering. Animals suffer emotionally and physically exactly like humans do. Every bit of data points to this being true. Animals have the same parts of their brain lighting up. They have the physiology for suffering, like nerves and stress hormones. They react like humans do through grief or cries of agony. There is no evidence that animals don't suffer. I already have a huge problem with the amount of suffering in the world for humans. It's so tremendous. But at least you can give a weak answer for why human suffering exists. Because Adam and Eve sinned against God, so suffering entered the world. There is no reason for animal suffering to exist. And yet animals suffer tremendously all the time in numbers that you can't wrap your head around for millions of years. They die slowly, stressed, or alone in painful ways, whether it be a lion eating an antelope or a polar bear slowly starving to death as its environment melts. And in a way, it almost feels worse, because they can't comfort themselves with stories of why their suffering matters or explain why it happens like humans try to do with religion. They just suffer not understanding why, and there's no good reason for it. Some people will try to say that suffering is necessary for the good that comes in the end, for the development of people and their story. But this isn't true for animals. It doesn't contribute to some reward in heaven or development of their character. It's not because they ate the fruit or need to be tested for their sin or need to be punished for their sin. It's so much unnecessary suffering. What a fucked up guy. If the explanation for human suffering is the original sin, animal suffering goes completely against that. And I've yet to find a good explanation that even comes close to explaining it. We can see in factory farming that mother cows having their calves ripped from them repeatedly causes them to go into depression and mourn and suffer. So we can't pretend that animals don't experience grief. As a Christian, I think I just didn't fully empathize with animals as much because I assumed that humans were different or that animals were very unlike us, so they weren't as aware of their suffering. But that's not true. When I started to learn how humans are animals and believe that in my body, not just know it as a scientific category, and how animals are not different than us, I began to understand how their conscious experience is more like ours than I ever thought. Animals grieve, cry, hurt, and unfortunately, that can only be explained by an uncaring neutral force or system like evolution, not a supposedly loving God. Evolution is just a fact of life produced from how the universe works, the laws of physics. It's not a knowing agent. It can't do anything differently. It's not conscious. A knowing, aware God could choose to do differently and didn't. If God were truly perfectly fair and loving and can do anything, he could have made a system different in so many ways. He could have made it so animals only ate plants. He could have made animals physiologically different than us so they don't experience pain or suffering or grief. And if you think he couldn't make the system different, I guess you're saying he isn't all that powerful or intelligent enough to figure it out. And it might have made sense for people in the Iron Age writing the Bible that suffering existed due to mankind's fall, because we didn't know about animal intelligence then. But we know now. We have the proof. And if your response is something like, well, God created evolution, this is how he created science to work, death and suffering has to exist for biology, nervous systems have to allow suffering in animals because blah, blah, blah. I will point back to the point that I said, where if he is an all-knowing, all-powerful God who created science, he can make it so it didn't work like that. I would also like to point out that we know animals have suffered long before the fall of mankind would have happened. We have fossils hundreds of millions of years old before humans even existed, showing mammals preying on each other and the babies of our ancient human ancestors literally being plucked out of the sky by predatory birds. Animals and humans suffered before the fall. There is no good explanation for suffering while the good God exists. No joke, I literally came to this conclusion a lot because of learning about how animals are more conscious than I thought and how they suffer in factory farming and other situations, but also because I literally just thought of a possum being scared in a storm and not understanding the storm, and I sobbed. And not to be a downer, but related to animal suffering, we also have to talk about the psychological suffering of people, not just in general, but specifically in Christianity. I sincerely believe, from what I learned, that some of Christianity is inherently harmful for many, not all, but many people. And it being harmful to some is enough for me not to believe it. And no, before you try to say,
only when the teachings are twisted.
One, who are you to decide what is or is not correct teachings? Because we've been trying to figure out for thousands of years and everybody thinks it's different. You think you really got it right this time. And two, I think it's inherent to the religion and part of its DNA, not just when it's twisted. I started learning more about this when I started learning about the harmful effects on people when leaving JMS. JMS was an extremely fear and anxiety-based religion, and it was extremely shame-based. It stunted you emotionally and taught you very unhealthy things for your mind and body. And the more I learned, the more I realized that I think this stuff also applies to Christianity, to maybe just a less extreme. And the effects on me were clear. After leaving religion, I felt like I was dying every day. And I'm not exaggerating. It felt like in my body I was dying every day, everywhere I went. I don't mean it as a hyperbole. I lived with constant chest pain. My Fitbit thought that I was doing intense cardio all the time. I had to get heart tests done. My body took every little thing as a threat, from someone tapping the brakes in a car to someone dropping a book. I would have intrusive mental visions of the way me and my loved ones would die, and I was fixated on the suffering in the world and how meaningless it was. I was constantly triggered by making the smallest mistakes, like a simple mistake at work, and it would cause disproportionately large meltdowns. Eventually, I got a diagnosis from my therapist, and I had developed CPTSD and OCD. And as my therapist and I began to dig into the roots of the CPTSD, I quickly learned a lot of it didn't just come from my time in JMS. Half of it came from my time as a normal Christian. Your nervous system is something that is trained by experience. It learns to detect threats and activate your fight or flight to keep you alive. So what happens if there's always a threat? When every moment you could sin or be walking on the path to hell, your nervous system learns from that experience. It being chronically activated due to hell fear or needing to police yourself from sin causes it to learn to never turn off. Your switch gets stuck on. The Body Keeps the Score is a book that explains a lot about trauma and how it affects the mind and body, and it explains that your body doesn't differentiate between threats like being chased by a tiger or emotional mental abuse. It elicits the same biological response, the same hormones, and the same neurotransmitters. It encodes the experience into your DNA the same. Our bodies didn't evolve to need to be able to differentiate if a threat is mental or physical. It just detects threats. Your amygdala controls the fear response, and it doesn't differentiate. PTSD and CPTSD are the results of your body not being able to exit the fight or flight stage and regulate out of it. Your nervous system becomes chronically activated, which is horrible on your body. Religious trauma resides in our bodies and nervous systems in the same way that trauma from war, developmental trauma, or sexualized trauma live inside us. Though the triggers of the environment of the original trauma may differ, how religious trauma lives in our bodies on a physiological level is the same. And this is from Laura E. Anderson, who wrote When Religion Hurts You, Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impacts of High Control Religion. A perfect example of what could cause this is the looming threat of eternal damnation, or of losing God's blessings and protection, or the threat of your worth and goodness as a human being. When everything you do is moralized as a sin, you're surrounded by threats all the time. Normal biological responses that you will experience, like sex drive, can be moralized. Your own thoughts can be sin. Needing to rest is considered being lazy as a sin. Completely normal things that are guaranteed to happen because you're a human being all of a sudden become threats all the time. You get locked in an activated state you can't exit, and CPTSD can develop. Now let's be super clear about this. These teachings are not inherently traumatic to everyone that hears them. So if you think some of the things I listed are not traumatic, congrats. Your body didn't encode it that way. But many people's bodies do. And as explained in Laura Anderson's When Religion Hurts You, everyone's bodies encode trauma in their nervous systems differently. Everyone has different thresholds of what stressors in their body will be coded as traumatic. For some people, the teaching of hell is inherently traumatic. For some people, it's not. For me, the hell teaching wasn't actually that traumatic. But the teaching of sin, and original sin, and inherent sin nature was traumatic. And my body coded it as a constant threat. Please know if you found a teaching traumatic from Christianity and people around you are calling you dramatic or seem like they did not find it traumatic, know you're not a baby. You're normal. It's just biology. So the case I'm building here is that if God created us, He created us so that some of His teachings are inherently traumatic for some people and not others. How is that a fair system? Would an all-knowing God just create a system like this where there are some people at a biological disadvantage just due to how their bodies are that they can't help? It makes no sense. People will try to frame it as a healthy fear of God. Your nervous system does not deactivate just because the fear is religious. Chronic fear is chronic fear, and your nervous system will treat it the same. To understand the next point, I think we should learn some new vocab. Spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas or practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, or unfinished developmental tasks. Keep this in mind as we go on to the next points. The Bible's teachings on emotions all involve suppression. The most it gives us for anxiety is thought-terminating cliches about them. And this severely impacted me, and I see it impacting Christians around me all the time. It does tell you to be joyful or to mourn when needed, but those aren't the only emotions. But they are the only ones that the Bible deems acceptable. The Bible describes anger and anxiety as negative things to be stopped. We've got this verse. We've also got like 1 Peter 5:7. Cast all your anxieties on Him, or Isaiah 35:4. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not, for the God will be your vengeance. He will come and save you. And again, with the same logic as before, if this helped you, great. It is inherently unhelpful for many, many people, though. And I would also encourage you to think about if it actually taught you how to process anxiety in a healthy way in your body, or if it just taught you to suppress it. Emotions serve a biological purpose. You can form healthy relationships with them that allows you to use them as wisdom and a helpful tool without being fully ruled by them. For example, anger is your body's way of signaling that your boundaries have been crossed. Anxiety wants to keep you safe. Sadness pushes you to seek comfort and connection. They're signals and communications from your body. Why would evolution do that if there's no benefit to them? But under Christian teachings, you never learn how to properly process them. It's just pray and give it to God, which does nothing except suppress it so you feel better for a moment. So it stays in your body. It causes dysregulation. Obviously, things like chronic anxiety are not a good thing, but if you never form a healthy relationship with it and learn how to process it out of your body, you'll never be able to have a healthy experience with anxiety or get out of it when you need to. Christianity serves as a security blanket, which can be okay, but it becomes dysfunctional how it's often used as a way to cope with any discomfort through spiritual bypassing. I cannot tell you how many funerals I've been to where they explicitly said not to be sad and not to mourn because we'll see them again in heaven soon. And I see the consequences of them not processing this mourning on their mental health. Another way that Christianity is inherently psychologically damaging is how it encourages you to be disconnected from your body. In Christianity, there's this constant demonization of the flesh and how it's different from your spirit. There's the spirit versus the body. You're taught that the flesh is deceitful and craves bad things, so you should subdue and control it. You're taught your body doesn't belong to you and God can do what he wants with it. You're taught that normal desires like sexuality are a sin, and this can be a recipe for harm because it disconnects you with your body, and that is horrible for humans. You are a body as much as you want to think that you're not. Your knee-jerk reaction may be, it doesn't mean literally the body, it means the part of you that wants to sin. But why do we refer to it always as the body? Why is it always sins of the flesh, like impure sex, gluttony, laziness, worldly desires, emotions, negative words, for all the normal things your body needs to be healthy? It just so happens that the ton of sins of the flesh are ones that occur in the body. That's a coincidence. Yeah, okay. You're at war with your body and you don't even realize it because you are so disembodied. This war with your body that you're waging can also lead to so many things like dissociative disorders. In Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, she explains that people with religious trauma often learn to dissociate to cope, and it's called disembodiment. And any religious trauma therapist will tell you that this disembodiment is harmful and something that they have to work on with every single one of their clients. Purity culture and treating premarital sex as a sin disconnects you from your body as well. You suppress and ignore normal healthy feelings. You beat yourself up over these normal feelings in your body that will happen because you're an animal. This can cause sexual dysfunction down the line for many, many people. It can cause sex to be painful and traumatic. And just because you wait till marriage doesn't mean those feelings wait until marriage. Your body wasn't wired for that. And as we discussed previously, your nervous system is trained over time through experiences. Just because you get married and you think sex is okay now doesn't mean that your body will suddenly forget the years that you spent acting like it's not okay or safe, or that it'll suddenly be okay with the years of disconnect and shame. After a lifetime of distrust and demonization with your body, it can be hard to be in it. It can be hard to interpret the signals from it. After religion, so many people have to go to therapy to relearn just how to be in your body and trust it again. And being in your body is essential for processing emotions, for feeling safe, for feeling confident. There's a reason religions do this. It puts the locus of control external to you and to your authorities. It's super effective for controlling people. And it's much like the next tool that religion uses to control people, shame. Shame is known to be the most destructive thing on your nervous system, mental health, and self-image. Chronic shame impacts your self-worth, how you see yourself, your identity, and more. Shame is so harmful and powerful because humans are biologically wired to avoid it at all costs. Humans are not the fastest, we're not the strongest. We survived in communities and working together. So being ousted from your group meant death, like guaranteed death. So shame is incredibly scary and dysregulating for your body. It was literally a threat to your existence before. It means you are closer to not surviving, and you can't fully grasp it until you're out of it. But Christianity is a shame-based religion, and if you think it's not, it's like a fish who doesn't know it's in the ocean because all it's ever known is water. The entire premise of Christianity is that you're inherently sinful, and you're not worthy of what God did for you, or what Jesus did for you. You're born into sin. You're inclined to it. The difference between guilt, which can be helpful for your relationships, and shame, which is unhealthy for everyone, is that guilt tells you, I did something bad, while shame tells you, I am bad. With Christianity's teachings on sin nature and the flesh, it is shame-based because it's making statements about your inherent being and the state in which you are. That is shame-based. This powerful shame keeps you locked in a cycle where they tell you something normal is shameful, so you feel shame, and then they sell you the cure to that shame. So many things are considered sin that you can't escape the chronic shame, and the cycle goes on forever, and it wreaks havoc on people's nervous systems. So to summarize, the teachings of Christianity stunted me emotionally and prevented me from being able to properly process emotions. Its teachings were traumatic, causing me PTSD that I still struggle with till today, and behaviors that have led me to developing OCD. When I was a Christian, I had no confidence, I was full of shame, and I was extremely anxious, even after doing everything right that Christianity told me to do, like praying, reading the Bible, attending church. And as soon as I started implementing the advice of a secular therapist, all of my issues began to get better. And again, let's be clear. If Christianity helped you, that's okay. And I'm happy for you. But when we're evaluating if something is true, I cannot believe that God's true teachings are traumatizing for a huge subset of people and stunts a lot of people emotionally. And when any improvement in mental health due to Christianity could easily be found somewhere else without all the truth claims and the dogma, that's enough proof for me that it is not true. If they were God's ultimate teachings, they would make everyone better. Honestly, I want to talk about one final point, but I think that'll have to be its own discussion later because of how much we've already talked about today. So look for a video in the future about how the Bible is a superhuman book that reflects the human psyche and human psychology more than an actual God. Most of my reasons for leaving Christianity revolve around how I believe it causes harm and how I think that harm disproves its claims. Upon my exit for religion, my empathy for other life experiences grew exponentially. I was no longer stuck in the playpen of Christianity where I could only put myself in others' worlds a limited amount, because of believing my limited perspective was the one true one. Because I had the psychological safety blanket of believing in purpose and eternal life, I could only truly see the vividness and intensity of harm and suffering in the world when I stopped numbing myself with that false security. And only when I experienced this tremendous suffering myself, and without being able to take the drugs religion offered me to bypass the pain. Once I began to see harm and suffering in its truest form, I knew this was a world explained best by uncaring forces in the universe that don't have a consciousness like evolution, and not an all-good, all-knowing God. We allow the psychological abuse and emotional stunting of religion because humans evolved to need a security blanket for our fear of death and meaninglessness. And I get it, because human psychology is drawn to tribalism and shared myths. Death and suffering exists because evolution works that way. It's a neutral force. That is much more logical than a supposedly wise and all-loving God who acts like an insecure, abusive boyfriend. It's more logical than an all-powerful, all-loving God who could have created a world without suffering and chose not to. And it makes more sense than a worldview supposedly being the one true wisdom from a fair God and then being toxic and traumatizing to a huge subset of people. I've learned that God is not here. We only have each other. So thank you for spending a small piece of your little bit of time on this earth with me as we go back to the basics of why I'm not a Christian anymore. In the future, I wanted to get more into spirituality, philosophy, etc. So let's continue to talk. And I know politics have been super overwhelming and horrible lately, so please take care of yourself. And please know that I see you and that truly we have each other.